Well, good evening, everybody. How you doing? People are waving. I'm Frank Sesno. I'm director of the School of Media and Public Affairs here at GW. We do journalism and we do political communication, and this is?
Olivier Knox. I'm the chief DC correspondent for SiriusXM, and I'm also the president of the White House Correspondents Association.
So tonight we have sort of joined forces, the White House Correspondents Association and GW, to explore, to pose the question, should the news take sides? And we have the benefit of having, as I like to call it, the rocket fuel of the conversation, which is a remarkable new study that has just been completed by Pew. You want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, it's a really deep dive into the world of regional and local news coverage, news outlets, how people feel about their local and regional news, where they're getting it, what they think about the reporters, what they think about our financial situation. It's a very interesting look at, and comprehensive look at regional news.
And for those of us who follow or care about this, for those of us here at this university who study it and teach it, for those of us who practiced it, which I have, local news really is the bedrock of journalism. It's where people connect with their journalists. Those are their neighbors. They are covering stories that affect their lives, their school boards, their cops, their mayors, the quality of the food in their supermarket. And that's what makes it real. But it's when it gets to the national level and to the White House and to national politics that we get into a very different kind of take.
Yeah, and I've told people before that I think regional stories are actually national stories in disguise. What's happening in one city or in one state can be found in other cities and states. There was a recent series by The Oregonian where they realized that it looked like the Saudi government had been helping Saudi citizens accused of serious crimes get back to Saudi Arabia and essentially avoid the American justice system. And the Oregonian dug into that and realized it wasn't just in Oregon, it was scattered in a cluster of other states as well. At the White House level, you know, one of the things I've noticed in my coughing fit years of covering the White House is the erosion of the local and regional news presence. You know, we used to have these big bureaus coming from all these different states coming to the White House and asking important regional questions or posing national questions but with a regional filter. And I've always told people I thought that Sean Spicer's idea of Skype seats enabling people who can't get to the briefing room physically was conceptually a very good idea. But now, you know, we've lost a lot of regional chains. It's changed the way the questions are asked in that room, what we're asking, how we're asking it, what we're asking about, and all those different things.
When the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Dallas Morning News or papers from across the country covered the White House, they brought a certain perspective and sensibility to that. So what we're going to do here this evening is take a look at, through this remarkable new survey that Amy Mitchell's going to walk you through in just a couple of minutes. What do we know about what's happening in local news and local journalism and how people regard that? And is there anything that we can extrapolate out that can be instructive to the national media and ultimately to the mediated experience that citizens have in the way they consume their information and their politics? And for that, we're very, very honored to be joined by two people from the Commission on Presidential Debates, because we've talked to them about this. And there is no event in American politics that is more important or more watched or more mediated through that screen than presidential debates. So if we think about this as kind of a ladder of information, local, regional, national, huge, I think we're going to be able to go into it all this evening, and we're going to take this in phases and then open it up to your questions. And I hope you have, since this is an evening about journalism, good, tough, really snarky questions, because it fits the moment.
Absolutely.
Why does the White House Correspondents Association, why do you care about local news? I mean, yes, I get it that papers aren't around, but when we talked about setting this up, this was something that you wanted to sink your teeth into, and I think it'd be interesting for you to share that.
Yeah, you know, on a couple of different levels. I mean, one, I got my start in journalism at AFP, the French news agency, and one of my jobs when I was covering Congress for AFP was basically to keep track of the biggest stories in all these different countries. So completely alien experiences, not writing for an American audience at all, but writing for Thailand, Australia, Tanzania, Germany. And so I had to track sort of what the issues were in all these different places. And when there was that one congressperson who cared and would give a press conference, I was the only reporter asking the questions. And it gave me a real flavor for what I think is one of the only reliable driving bias of the news media, which is audience bias, which is looking at your audience and saying, what do they want to hear, what do they want to know? But it has an effect in the kinds of questions that you ask. it's not just who sits in those briefing room seats, it's the quality and quantity of the questions that are being asked. And I think we lose a lot in that briefing room when everyone is asking variations on the same question.
And just so you know where I'm coming from on this, I started at a very small radio station in Vermont, town of 16,000, with another city across the river in New Hampshire of about 30,000. I mean, you are part of the community when you're that small. I came to Washington with the Voice of America and then to AP. So I was with a global wire service, news service, and then to CNN. So I have seen these things, and I will say, and I'm going to be very interested, we'll call Amy up here in a minute. We're also joined by Paul Huntsman, who's the owner and publisher of the Salt Lake City Tribune, to give us a sense of how it's actually happening on the ground. They are very different kinds of journalism with very different connections with audience. And that notion of audience, especially in the world of cable and social media and all talk all the time, is really the defining characteristic and probably one of the key flaws and problems and challenges that we've got today. So, without further ado, how about Amy?
Yeah, let's bring on Amy.
Amy, come on, Amy. So, Amy Mitchell is the Director of Journalism Research at the Pew Research Center. She's amazing, but in addition to being amazing, she's responsible for the center's research related to news information, including how the public accesses, engages with, and creates news, what news organizations are providing, and how technology is changing it all. Let's do one question here, and then we'll sit down. Tell us about this survey and when you did it, how many you talked to, over what period of time?
Sure. So we surveyed people in the fall of 2018, and we really had two main goals. The first was to be able to take a national look across the U.S. about the state of how people are getting local news, the extent they're following it, what's their attitudes about it, to get a sense across the country. We had not done a full national scope look in many years, and I am not aware of other data that would speak to that as well. So to get this national level sense of the state of local news, and then to also be able to bring a local lens to it. So we did that two ways. And that required a lot more people to be in the mix of who we surveyed. So the survey itself is about 35,000 U.S. adults. So it's quite a large survey. With that number, we were able to then go into individual local areas, 99 in particular, that we created an interactive around, so people can go into this interactive, search there, put in their local city, and see the data for their local area. And then those that were smaller, we cluster together into certain groups. And then the other thing we did was we were able to take certain external data from, say, Census Bureau and some other sources that speak to community characteristics, like higher or lower proportion of blacks or higher or lower broadband access, and see how individuals in those types of communities might differ in their attitudes or their habits around local news.
Why don't I invite you to take a seat, and Olivia over there, and you've got some slides, and you're going to walk us through it. Olivia?
Yeah. So Amy, I got into journalism in July of 1996, and really very few things have changed more dramatically than just the physical act of how people get their news, from a paper on newsprint to this device that I carry in my pocket that has the sum total of human knowledge, but which I mostly use to argue with strangers. And you looked carefully at platforms and providers of local and regional news. What did you find?
We did, and the first thing, of course, is, are people paying attention to local news? And we find indeed they are. Local news has always been, an important part of Americans' diet and interest when it comes to news. And we have, 3/4 that are at least somewhat or very closely, with about 1/3 that are very closely following local news. So local news matters to Americans across the country. Then we dove into asking them about, to what extent has that digital experience really worked itself into the local news system? And we asked your preference for the type of pathway. So do you like to go to a TV set? Do you like to go online digitally? Whether it's your phone or your laptop? Do you like to listen to a radio set or read something in actually hard copy? And what we find is almost as many people, 37%, say they prefer digital as prefer TV, the TV set itself. And so there's definitely a movement to digital in the local news landscape. Then within that, we have the different provider types, right? So there are television stations, there's your daily newspaper, there's radio, which offer things in a mix of platforms. So that's what you can see in the data on this slide here, which is that when we ask about specific providers, local TV stations themselves themselves still have the widest reach. You can see that figure there. 86% that are ever turning to TV station providers, 38% often. And then it goes down the list. You have sort of your big three, your TV stations, your daily newspapers, your radio news stations. And then there's this mix of your kind of second tier, secondary types of less traditional providers. And while their number overall and those people who are often relying on them are, significantly smaller than the big three, they do add up. And you have 28% that are often getting local news from at least one of those six.
Let me ask the audience, just a shout out if we can. Where are you all from originally, like students or wherever? Like shout out a town or a city. San Diego. St. Louis. Rochester, Kansas City. Cleveland. So in communities like these are fairly significant cities. Do you have local papers? You read your papers? You watch TV? Local television? Yeah?
St. Louis Post-Dispatch isn't printing as much anymore.
Exactly. What's changing?
Yeah.
Because I know one of the big changes is a big drop off in local television ratings. We'll hear from Paul in a little bit what's happening in the print industry, but what
what you see, what you see if you look at these provider types, so the mix of those colors, the yellowish, kind of reddish color there on the side, is the way people are accessing them. So you can see TV stations, the vast majority of people are still largely going to the TV set. So TV stations, that audience has not migrated to the digital landscape the way audiences to consume that information the way that for most of these others we're seeing a significant portion of their audience it's primarily getting them online. So that one of the big shift is that digital is present. There's a wider mix of the types of places people are getting some of their local news from, including those that don't actually have journalists as a part of what they're doing.
So
right?
what kind of marks are people giving their local journalists?
They're giving them high marks. So in general, people are pretty supportive of the local news that they're seeing. But one of the things that we asked about was this question of community connection, right. And the sense that, one of the things that's talked a lot in journalism circles today is that how the audience and that having that close connection, and to what extent has that diminished when you've had cutbacks, you have fewer reporters, you have consolidation. And so we asked about the importance of that, and you can see people put a really high premium on that sense of connection, on understanding the community, understanding the history of the community, engaging at a personal level with the community in the 80 percentiles that are saying that that's important. But there's less actual, less consensus around whether journalists are meeting that bar. And so you have a majority, 63%, that say their journalists tend to be in touch with the community, but then it goes down, fewer that feel they actually have local influence. We asked about local news coverage. So is the coverage you're getting actually mostly about the area you live in? So is it about your town, your area, your city, or is it about some nearby place? And we have about half of adults that are saying that most of the local news they're getting is actually about an area outside where they live. Which is a pretty, startling figure when you think about what it is they're then learning about and hearing about. 21% that have actually ever spoken with a local journalist themselves. So there's definitely less consensus as to the degree to which that sense of community connection exists.
I have to tell you, 21% who've spoken to a local journalist sounded awfully high when I saw it. It's like New Hampshire and presidential candidates, right?
Yeah,
Can you slice and dice this data a little bit for us in terms of if not causation, at least correlation to either partisan attitudes or backgrounds or urban versus rural or Republicans, Democrats? What do we know about these raw numbers in those terms?
So one of the things we see, if you look at certainly in the question of your local coverage, of it being about your local area, people that say they live in rural areas were far more likely to say the coverage was not about where they live, was about a nearby city, than those that live in urban or suburban areas. So we definitely see differences there. When we get to sort of talking about the mix of topics that people find important for their daily life, there's a lot of difference there when it comes to types of communities. So people that have live in a higher Black proportion of the population area are more concerned, put more importance on topics like jobs, crime, those types of areas. So we definitely see differences based on some of those sociodemographics.
What about, you talked about engagement and connection. Can you talk about what you found in terms of how people see that sense of connection with their journal.
Yeah, absolutely.
What that actually means.
So here, if you look at the raw numbers, you see that sense of connection. There's definitely variance, and then when you apply that to the evaluations of media, that's where it gets really interesting. So if you first look at overall, people give pretty high ratings to their news media. The majorities that are saying they do well at a number of these different types of jobs. But when you look at that based on whether people feel that sense of connection, that's where the big gaps start to arise. So here, sorry, I'm going to go to this slide. You can see this is people with the dark bars who say their journalists are in touch with the community versus those who say they aren't. And you can see there's like 31 percentage point differences there in their ratings of their local news media based on whether they feel their media are in touch or not in touch.
What does that tell you? What do you think?
So that sense of connection really matters to people's overall evaluation of the job their news media are doing. And the same thing plays out if you put the question of confidence in main source. Majority of people say they're pretty confident in the main source, their main news source, getting them the information that they need. But big differences if you feel that sense of connection as opposed to if you don't.
How did you ask this question? How did you define connection and ties to the community in this survey?
So we did it two ways. So for the sense of connection, there are sort of 4 questions that all kind of speak to that area. One is the sense of being in touch with the community, the sense that local journalists actually have influence on the community. Then there is that degree to which the coverage is actually local to where you live versus another area. And then there's also that other sense of sort of your connection by having spoken to a journalist. But if you look at each of those, especially those first 3, and you separate the people who feel that or don't feel that, these gaps exist across all these different measures for each of those questions. So that's where the finding really became very striking and reinforced throughout this data. And it plays out in the question like the job ratings. It also plays out when you look at sort of how easy it is for people to find information on the topics that they're interested in.
A couple more, Amy, and then we're going to ask Paul to come up, and we'll see how your findings kind of apply in his very real world of publishing and ownership of a major brand. What about how this all trickles down to the business model? I mean, how an audience feels about its journalism is going to drive. I mean, we certainly know when we look at national news, it's about clicks, it's about eyeballs, it's about ratings, it's about profit. Mm-hmm. How's that going at the local level?
Well, there's certainly, from the public sense, they think it's going just fine.
The public thinks
public thinks it's going fine. So we asked people how you think your local news media are doing financially. 71% of U.S. adults say they're doing somewhat or very fine. Financially. So that sense of what journalists see as that struggle and what we see in headlines every day about more job cuts, about layoffs, about closures, not just at newspapers, but at digital natives, at other kind of outlets, it has not translated to the public sense of the industry at all.
You asked how they're paying for it.
And only 14% say they've paid in the past year for local news through a donation, a subscription, or some kind of membership.
Wait. 14% say they paid in the last year for any local news?
For any local news.
Now, does that include people who are watching their local news channel, which is free but has advertising? I mean, do you consider that paying for it?
That does not. So what we wanted to get at was sort of that direct involvement, through a direct contribution. So it would not include, say, if a portion of your cable bill goes to support the local channel through retransmission fees
so just to
or
prove
advertising.
how typical of an audience we've got here, how many people, be honest here, how many people in the room have paid for local news, some kind of local news, in the last month? Raise your hands.
Not a very typical audience, I don't think.
No, but still, it's hardly everybody, right?
Yeah,
So
hardly ever. More than 14%, I think.
Okay, well, we'll ask Paul if that's different. You got any more?
Yeah, I got one more. Would you go back to the slide that has the issues that people are trying to track down?
Topic, that one.
So I thought this was really, really interesting, and I was hoping you could walk me through specifically the prices question. Mm-hmm. First of all, what does that mean, and what lessons did you draw from the position that prices occupies in the important or interesting column versus the position prices occupies in the column that describes how easily information is obtained.
Yeah, this was a really interesting combination of data. So we first asked people interest, importance, and topics, and that alone is interesting because you see, quite a nuance in people's minds in terms of what is really important for my daily life. What's important, but not daily. But what am I interested in versus really none of the above? I don't really need that information at all. And you can see prices ranking third there with a very high proportion that are at least interested in it. And it ranks also very high in that important for my life category as well.
Is that gas prices?
Yeah, what is-
grocery
So
prices,
what we talk about
real
is
estate?
changing prices, sort
About
of your
what?
local changing
Anything?
prices in your area. So I would say it's gas, it's grocery. I would say it's basically the cost I have to live, the things I need to buy.
Healthcare?
So it's changing, it's changing prices, meaning local,
local.
your local prices. So those would sort of be, the economic figures. But we know gas prices are something that,
Yeah.
Americans respond very strongly to, that sort of change in gas prices in the economic crisis. That's what, back in the recession, that's what they really wanted information about, what they were following most closely versus what, some of what was being covered. But so then we ask for that same set of things, how easy it is to get information on that, if you're at least interested in it. And that's where we see a disconnect in certain cases between the importance and interest people place on that versus the ease they have in finding it. So if you follow that prices, you see that going much further down the list, second from the bottom, in how easy it is people say it is to get that information.
All right, last one here. What about to our question, should the news take sides? So people have said in your survey that they want their reporters to be engaged.
Mm-hmm.
What does engagement mean, and what doesn't it mean in terms of that position? I mean, I think many of us have watched and heard a lot of national media, and there seems to be a lot of taking sides in the national media. Is that different at the local level?
So we actually see people draw the line there. So
They draw the line.
They draw the line in engagement, and they want that community connection, they want that engagement, but they generally do not think journalists should take a view, express their own personal views about local issues. 60-some% that say they should not do that, as opposed to saying that they should. And this is an area where we did see some political divide. So the Democrats were roughly split, kind of 50-50 between that, whereas Republicans very much more in the 70% that say that should not occur. Journalists should not express their views.
Why don't we invite Paul up? Paul, why don't you come join us? Paul Huntsman joins us from Salt Lake City. Anybody been to Salt Lake City? Anybody been to Utah? Hooray. All right. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us for this. You're the publisher and the owner of Salt Lake City Tribune.
Yes.
How long now have you?
So I acquired the paper about 3 years ago from Alden Capital. For those of you that are aware of Alden Capital is the owner of Digital First Media. And they've been in the news a bit for being very aggressive cost cutters of local newspapers.
Why did you acquire the paper?
Short answer, betterment of the community. Alden had put it into a situation where it was in danger of going out of business.
The Tribune was going out of business?
The Salt Lake Tribune has been the paper of record in Salt Lake City since 1871, and they made some short-term financial decisions that impacted the long-term viability of the newspaper. So I've come from a family of, don't mean to sound too altruistic here, but I've come from a family of public service and giving back.
I think we've heard
giving
the
back to the
Huntsman
community
name once or twice.
and so I'm not sure why, but I felt I was actually the only one that was in the process of acquiring the Salt Lake Tribune. But
Did you have a journalistic calling?
no, I was a political science undergraduate, but my occupation is primarily buying and selling businesses.
And one last one, and then it's your turn. I promise I'll shut up. I'm interested in, just for the background of the crowd here, what was the size and the reach of the Salt Lake City Tribune 15 years ago, and what is it now?
So the Salt Lake Tribune, if you look at the circulation as far as the print, it topped out around about 150 to 170,000 daily subscribers. Today that number's down to about 40,000 subscribers, and so if you look at staffs with newspapers, there's a rough ratio that I've learned in the industry. So for every 1,000 subscribers, you have about one journalist. So it's gone from about 160 to 170 members of the staff, and now we're in the mid-50s.
You've gone from 170 to the mid-50s.
Yes, yes.
What were your main takeaways from this Pew survey, either on the issues or the audiences or the connections that they're looking for? When you looked at this, when you heard us talking about it, what lessons did you draw for the Salt Lake City Tribune?
So my job as a publisher is to really look at what is the sustained business model for local journalism. I was very concerned, I think, which was mentioned, that 71% of the local population believe that their local newspapers, and I guess we should also include television stations, radio stations as well, are on financially strong footing. And if you go back to the fourth quarter results of 4 of the 7 top publicly held newspapers, they actually had a loss in the fourth quarter. Now, if you've ever looked at a newspaper over Thanksgiving, you'll notice it's very, very thick, and that's usually for a newspaper. The fourth quarter is usually the most, well, not usually, it's always the most lucrative in terms of profitability. I never really appreciated how thick newspapers were until I went to the grocery store Thanksgiving. I was so excited looking at the Salt Lake Tribune, and I didn't even look at the content. I went through all the ads and everything. I was so excited to see how thick that newspaper was that day. But it's the first time that 4 of the 7 actually had a loss that quarter, and that's after significant cost cutting that they've gone through, increases in paywalls. So the trend line is very, very, very concerning for the industry in general. I think we're at a very important, transformative time in local journalism in terms of what are local newspapers going to do to sustain themselves long term, because communities absolutely have to have a strong journalism community in order to continue to progress and to move forward and to ensure our democratic principles here as a country.
Washington Post has or claims 2 million digital-only subscribers.
Yes.
The New York Times claims close to 4 million digital-only subscribers.
Yes.
A lot of people say, well, that's the brave new world. People are going to go digital, and they'll pay for that. How many do you have?
So for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and Washington Post, they have a national audience to draw from. For a newspaper such as Salt Lake Tribune, we just introduced a paywall this last year. We're just under 10,000. For other markets our size, that's not unusual for the first year. We anticipate to continue to grow that number. But for a citizenry that is local to consuming local online news for free for the last 20 plus years, I think is how long the Salt Lake Tribune's been online. We're going through a transition as a community.
I kind of need to put an exclamation point there, right? You just said New York Times 4 million, Washington Post 2 million, Salt Lake Trib 9,000.
Yes, yes.
How do you stay in business?
That's something that we're trying to figure out right now. It's something that all publishers are trying to encounter. Look, digital subscriptions alone will not sustain newsrooms.
How many
long-term.
How many in the room digitally subscribe to a newspaper? You pay for it every month. Well, you got a very good crowd here. Go to Salt. What's your right?
sltrib.com.
Well, you know what's interesting, I would add to that, because we did a follow-up for the 76% that don't pay and asked them why. And, there are a list of reasons. And what rises to the top, by far, is because there's so much free content out there. Quality was only ranked first by 10%. So it's not so much a question of quality in people's minds, it's that there's so many other ways that you can get at least the nuggets of what you think is informing you.
And I was going to ask something built on that, basically, which is who's your biggest competition? Where did those readers go to get their news? The Salt Lake Tribune has been the only quote-unquote independent newspaper in the state of Utah. The other primary source of news that the state has received their news from is a newspaper, a television station, and a radio station that's owned by the LDS Church.
So as news consumers look at their news, they want it filtered through the largest, perhaps the most influential institution in the state of Utah, or do you want independent journalism? And I think really, as I've looked at the trend line over the last 5 to 10 years, I see there's more and more concern where readers really do want to look at and get their news from an independent source.
It's really interesting, and it actually raises the other question that you asked about was, and our question tonight, should the news take sides? So your community, you have a very large Mormon community.
Yes.
You're going to
Yes.
look at the world through a particular prism. I know that
Yes.
your paper focuses on religion a lot. How do you handle that? Do your reporters take sides? Does their engagement in the community, whether it's through the church or politics or anything else,
Sure.
how do they relate, and how would you compare that to what you see at the national level?
Sure, no, that's a very interesting question. So our mission as a newspaper, like I think all newspaper, is to empower the citizens, our citizens with information, and we gather that information by asking a lot of questions. We have a very outstanding professional news staff, but I think where you run into the challenge is the difference between reporters and opinion-based journalism. So as being the publisher, I'm also part of our opinion group. And just to give you an example, at the end of each year, we select a Utah of the Year. Now, this particular individual may not have deserved it based upon positive things that he or she may have done during the year. So we debated it quite a bit. Quite frankly, I wanted my father. He was in poor health and had given away hundreds of millions of dollars that year. But I just acquired the newspaper, and I thought, boy, this will really undermine the quote independence of the newspaper. So we ended up going with Orrin Hatch that year, who's the senator in Utah, the longtime senator that just retired. Senator Hatch that year was perhaps the most instrumental senator in terms of passing President Trump's tax bill in 2017. He also, as part of payback for getting that through, he got Trump actually to come out to Utah and to dismantle 2 of our national monuments, which are just absolutely beautiful, Escalante and the newly established Bears Ear. And then he also went back on his word of saying this is going to be my last term. He was 84 years old, and he said, well, I think maybe I may want to run for another term. Anyways.
Because 90, you're just starting to catch on.
That's right, and that kept out a whole generation of new and upcoming individuals that may want to run for the Senate. So as we prepared to do our piece, I've actually got our DC correspondent here. He actually did the news profile on Senator Hatch, and we did an opinion piece. Well, the opinion piece was not flattering on Senator Hatch at all. But unfortunately, who got the flack for that? It was our DC correspondent, who actually wrote a wonderful profile on Senator Hatch. And unfortunately, our DC bureau here was persona non grata in Senator Hatch's office, and they did not speak to him for the remainder of his term because of the editorial that we wrote.
Were you accused of fake news?
No, we were just accused of just being too hard on the senator. And so it's just trying to find that right balance that so many readers sometimes don't differentiate between reporters and op-ed or opinion sections of news.
That's the number one complaint that I hear from readers and viewers and listeners. The number one.
What?
I can't tell what's reporting and what's opinion anymore.
Well, the op-ed, obviously, as you go online, it's harder to find the op-ed section because it's not at the end of the section of A1. But yeah, that's as news, particularly on television, on radio, on the internet. I mean, on the internet, everyone's a publisher now because everyone has a social media account. And newspapers are one of the few platforms left that actually still do traditional
But you
reporting.
assume that people understand that the front page is news and the op-ed page is opinion, and they're managed by different staffs. I mean, not you
Sure.
personally, but
Yeah.
one does, and I think we can't make that assumption.
I don't think we can.
And the cable industry contributes by having everything all mess. Everybody's offering opinions. Reporters sitting next to commentators, who are next to analysts, and on it goes forever. So the public scratches its head and says, you know, what the heck's going on here? I think this is a good moment for us to invite other people to the stage. What do you
Absolutely.
think? Should we do that?
Yeah.
Please keep your seats, and we're going to make the transition now and ask our incredible stagehands, who I think are union employees, to bring out some chairs, and we're going to invite Frank Fahrenkopf and Janet Brown and Anita Kumar up to the stage. So let's come back to what we just heard here from Paul, this connection between opinion and news and the implications for you at the White House Correspondents Association, because you, pal, are in the crosshairs on that one.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's, I never thought I'd see a day where a statement like I support the First Amendment would be perceived by a sizable chunk of the audience as a direct attack on the President of the United States. I would suggest it says more about the President and his supporters than it does about the statement itself. But of course we are. But I do hear, and in a lot of cases, I don't actually, I tend to agree with a lot of the complaints. It's true that if you turn on your TV and you have a host and a partisan official and a reporter, it can be difficult for someone watching this, for someone tuning this, say, somewhat haphazardly, to distinguish who is giving, because if I contradict the partisan official, then it looks, in our very binary sort of crossfire kind of system, it looks like you're making a partisan
Olivia,
point.
you live this life now, right? Because you go on cable channels sometimes to
Yep.
talk. Are you on as a pundit or are you on as a reporter?
I'm on as a reporter or as the WHCA president.
Okay, but you also have a radio show, right?
I do.
What's your radio show?
It's a news show on Sirius XM from 6 to 7 Eastern, and I bring in a lot of regional and local reporters every chance I
Do you have
get.
opinion on that show?
I have a couple of opinions, a couple of things that I come back to. I don't express an opinion on everything. My goal is to try to help people to understand what's happening in the news, either with a glossary or an explainer. One of my most popular features was with an economist, and it started with "What's a tariff?" And at the end of that show, Twitter blew up for me. It was like, thank God, finally somebody who doesn't assume that I took econ or went to college or whatever. Now I understand this stuff. So it's a different. The areas in which I do express opinions are, one, on Congress ceding too much war powers authority to the executive branch, which is something I've always covered and talked about, and I let myself show a little more leg on that. But in general, it's about trying to help people understand what they're seeing in other news outlets, at least as much as it is just to do a straight recap of the news. But I deliberately do not do cable TV on the internet, on the radio. If I did that, people could just go to cable TV on the radio.
Which they do too. Frank, Janet, Anita, come on up and join us. I'm actually going to pull this chair a little closer. If I'm stepping out of bounds, oh well. There we go. Can you see everybody? Yes, does that work for you? All right. Anita, you're a political correspondent.
Yep.
You've covered the White House. You've covered regional news as well. What resonates with this conversation with you?
I think the thing that I took from what you talked about was the thing about connection, right? Connecting with your readers, or readers connecting with you.
But your readers aren't local readers, right? Your your readers are Washington readers? Do you think your readers are national? Who do you think your readers are?
Well, I've been at Politico 2 months. I assume my readers are DC readers, are DC people.
Mostly DC people.
I mean, I would assume so. It could be other people. I just have had a long history of local news. So, when I was a local reporter, not in Washington, and worked for local papers, you would see people in the grocery store, and you would, people that you covered and wrote about, and people would know you and know about you in a way that they don't know about me now, right? So that they would know you and could trust you because they know you. When I came to Washington, my first job was working for the Tampa Bay Times in Florida, and I was in a 3-person bureau. There are 0 people here now for that paper. 0, as of a couple months ago. It's a huge paper now too. It's huge. They bought another paper. They bought the Tampa Tribune, so they are a massive paper, but with no people in Washington. I would connect to people when I called them, and I'd call people in Florida, or I'd call, people on Capitol Hill, or go to Capitol Hill, and there you get some sort of street cred by, I used to live in Florida. I know that area. Here's where I owned a house. I mean, it really, people would relate to that. Oh, well, you lived there, and you know our issues, and you know how it works. It also helped, of course, that I would write about things with an I, like Olivier said, things that people wanted to know about, right? I'm dating myself here, but I mean, this was during the George W. Bush second term, and I wrote,
talk about dating yourself. That is not.
Nah, it's not dating myself. I could tell you a lot about Social Security. That was the big Social Security push. And I covered a lot of Social Security, and I covered a lot of immigration, because that's what people cared about. I mean, I covered a lot of other things too, but it was very much tailored to Florida and what people wanted to read, and what the Florida members of Congress were doing up here. My last job before Politico was working for McClatchy, which is, if you don't know, a chain of 30 papers across the country. And I was covering the White House, and I didn't really, we went through a lot of iterations in that bureau to try to figure out how to not lose money, right? Mostly, I would say, near the end there, I was not writing anything differently. I was covering the White House. I wasn't really writing for a particular paper. But, you would have an eye towards things that would matter. But it's really funny. I'll just tell you this one story. So in the McClatchy Bureau, there's still a very large bureau, even though there's been some cutbacks. If you wanted to call someone in Lexington, that's one of the papers we own, if you wanted to call a person in Lexington, you would try to find a phone that wasn't a 202 number. I don't know what the area code in Lexington is, but you would try to find a phone that was from there, and you would say you were from the Lexington Herald Leader instead of McClatchy, because you wanted them to talk to you, right? You wanted them to call you back. When we would do polls, we would try to do that. We would say we were from so-and-so paper instead of McClatchy.
Frank, if I may, and then I'll
go ahead.
run with it. But Frank, before we turn to you in your capacity as co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates and kind of take it to that level, for those in the audience who don't know, Frank Fahrenkopf has been in this town a long time. He was the head of the Republican National Committee. He was very involved in the Reagan administration. I covered the Reagan White House, so I've known Frank for a very long time. And of course, I've seen the changes from the journalistic side. But in this notion, Frank, of the news taking sides, from where you sit, from the political side, how substantial a change have you seen? And is it principally channeled and amplified through this cable and talk radio universe we've got, or do you see it across the board?
I've got to start by going back to something that was in the study.
In the study.
My wife and I have 3 daughters. When they were in college, they all wanted to go to Lauderdale on spring break. And we said, you're going to Florida, but you're coming with Mom and Dad to Sanibel Captiva. And my wife and I started a little experiment. We would take the New York Times, when we got on the airplane to fly to Fort Myers, we'd have a copy of the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we would look at what was on the front pages of that newspaper. And then when we got off the plane in Florida, we got the Fort Myers, I don't know what the name of the paper was. And it was amazing. Now, of course, it wasn't a period like the last 2 years. But what was on the front page of the Post or the New York Times was on page 6 of the Fort Myers.
So it's always been
So,
in some
it's
ways.
all local stuff. It's so important, I think, when you're outside of the journalistic bubbles that we have on both ends of the country. Now, I've talked to you about this before. I will date myself and you. Walter Cronkite used to have, he was the one everyone believed when he was doing his show for CBS. And what Walter prided himself on was giving the facts, giving the news, not opining on the news. He did later in life, at the end of his term, he opined about the Vietnam War, which he was very serious about. But 3 times a week, there came a man, I'll never forget, he was so distinguished. His hair was gray, pulled back, double-breasted suit. And his name was Eric Severide. And underneath, it would say opinion. So that you knew that this was editorial, Paul. He was giving you his view of what the facts as put out by Walter Cronkite were. That has disappeared. I think it started to disappear with the morning shows on the major networks. It used to be that Today's Show, Good Morning America, were deemed by the networks themselves as entertainment venues and not news venues. And the evening news and reporters, it was something totally different. And somewhere along the way in the last 20 years, that merged and it stopped. And so it's news all the time. So I think it's tremendously important. And I think it's very, very serious, because there is no distinction anymore as to what is in fact the facts and what is opinion and who's doing it. Now, we did a demonstration, and it ties in, Janet can add to this, when a few years ago with the debates, we had something called Debate Watch. And we had all over the country, we had people who would come to public libraries or schools and so forth, and they would watch the debate. And the minute the debate was over, the television set was turned off. And those people were involved in a discussion of what you liked, what you didn't, who won, who lost, et cetera. And they weren't listening to the talking heads of the networks, because as you know, the minute that debate's over, all the networks have this panel who says who won, who lost, what happened. Amazing difference in view. So I think it's a very serious problem. And I think journalism, writ large, has to make a determination as to whether or not there's going to be a difference between stating the facts and opining on the facts.
Anita, when you were at McClatchy, when I was at AFP, we would get requests from major papers across the world saying, hey, there's this thing, we hear there might be this legislation in Congress, can you find out what's going on with that? We would get these on basically Royal Command performances. Did that exist at McClatchy as well? Did you get asked by the Lexington Herald later to go talk to someone? And how did you decide, I mean, I assume you got more than one, so how would you decide to prioritize them, and how did you go about doing that?
So we have, or McClatchy, since I'm not there anymore, has people that generally report for those papers. So we have the Charlotte Observer and the Raleigh News and Observer, and there's a North Carolina reporter. So that reporter really did that, although we still got a lot of questions. How we prioritize, quite frankly, if it was a bigger paper. I mean, if it was a more important paper in the chain, a bigger paper, then we might prioritize it. But you know, it's an interesting thing in this bureau, and as I said, it changed a lot. How to cover the local news, how to cover Washington for those papers. There were so many iterations of that, and at the end, when I left, there were people like me that covered, you know, national beats, but there were a lot of people in that bureau that are now affiliated with that paper, or even working for that paper, like the Sacramento Bee. There's a Sacramento Bee reporter. It was the same person, but now they're directly reporting to that paper so that they can connect more. Yeah.
Janet, when you hear and see these results from Pew, and you hear this conversation about opinion and all the rest, you're already working on 2020 on the debates?
We have been for 15 months.
For 15 months? Oh, wow, lucky you. Do you know where they're going to be? You want to announce anything then?
You want to just have one here?
Yes. And Michael will moderate.
Yeah, yeah.
We have students. That's what we should do. We should have students moderate the debate. How does this conversation resonate with what you're up against, Janet, and you know, the whole question of the engagement of a reporter, the taking sides of a reporter, the role, because your moderators are all reporters, and is that getting harder to find a moderator because everybody's got an opinion?
The hardest decision we have is
the hardest decision you have is finding.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because
these are, as you know well, Frank, these are 4 90-minute chunks of time that take place in the 5 weeks before the election. They are without commercial. They run straight through with no break. This is enormously valuable time that is covered by all of the networks. It's covered by the White House pool, and it's put out on all of the networks simultaneously here and by an enormous number of the networks internationally. The audiences for debates eclipse any other kind of political programming. We figure that conservatively, The first debate in 2016, when you add online and international, was about 120 million viewers.
120 million American in this
No,
country?
that's worldwide.
Worldwide.
It was about 80 million here.
Make sure, we want to clarify that Janet and I have nothing to do with the primary debates, which we sort of think are circuses. We're talking about the general election.
Just the general
debates.
election.
Yeah.
So we have an obligation to make sure that this time is used in a way that is the most effective, the most helpful, the most educational, that the information that viewers and listeners on whatever kind of format actually find this useful, which exit poll data, and Pew does wonderful work on this, have shown for many cycles, in fact, are cited by voters, actual voters, as being very helpful in helping them make up their mind how to cast their ballots. Between the time in 1987 that the commission was formed and now, we have gotten away from the traditional panel of journalists with a moderator, where you had at least 4 other participants on the stage with the candidates as a part of that format, so that in the last many cycles, each debate has been moderated by a single journalist who has control of the time. And in 2012 and 2016, the time in 2 of the presidential debates was divided into 6 15-minute pods, each of which focused on one major issue that was selected and announced ahead of time by the moderator. The moderator always is the only person that knows the questions. The candidates don't know, we don't know. So you can drive and modernize format constantly, which is what we are trying to do to make sure that this time is being used in a way that is effective. If you don't have a moderator that understands how to do that deftly, then you've got a problem. And it is safe to say that most people have not moderated 90 minutes without any kind of break in front of a 120 million person audience.
So one of we've addressed the ARG, it's all opinion complaint. There's another, and I think considerably more sophisticated criticism of the news media, which is that where we take sides is in the stories we do cover, don't cover. You know, if you come from a certain background, maybe you have a blind spot on something. Some of the criticism of the last round of debates had to do with no questions about climate change. How can you, I mean, assuming you think it's something you need to fix, how do you fix it? Is there a way to get, is there a way to have the questions reflect a broader array of concerns than in the past? I mean, I'd love for your perspective on that.
Well, obviously it's incredibly tough for a moderator to decide if you've got 6 topics in a 90-minute debate, how are you going to choose those 6 topics? And if you look at Jim Lehrer and Bob Schieffer, both individuals who've moderated several debates for us, they've actually taken time away from their day jobs. They not only don't do their day jobs, including the weekend shows, they don't cover the campaigns, they don't cover the candidates, they go into seclusion and basically work on this. And they, needless to say, take enormous amounts of information into account in terms of what the public is saying they are most concerned about. It is based on their own reporting, their staff's online research, online submissions. So the question is, how do you arrive at those 6 topics for your debate? And when you Jim's approach was to take very big topics, including the economy. He actually gave 2 segments to in 2012. National security. One could argue that it would be easy to get into climate change in either one of those. But I think our moderators have shown a very firm commitment to the notion that ideally the moderator should be nothing more than a facilitator and really let the focus be on the candidates, which is what all of the public
You had a
feedback
firestorm when you've had moderators who have appeared to take a position.
That's exactly right.
Correct the candidates.
And to your point, though, the one debate that we do that just turns out to be the biggest pain for us to put on, but is the most favorite of the American people, is the town hall meeting.
Yes.
And in the town hall meeting, we have citizens from the area where we are, and they all, if they want to ask a question about a particular issue, they submit those to the moderator. The moderator is the only one who sees them. And most of our moderators are looking to see which are the most popular issues that are out there in the minds of the average citizen. Mm-hmm. And so it may be, I don't know, I haven't asked Anderson and Martha, who did the last, how many did you get in, who requested that you do something about climate change? But I think clearly, with the attention that's on it now, I find it hard to believe that our moderators.
Oh, there's
have
not a
time.
chance that
Yeah,
that issue is not going
they've
to
gotta
come up
go.
in this next round of debate. Let's tie this together a little bit, and Anita, Frank, Paul, and Pat, think about this for a moment. You heard what Amy and 35,000 people had to say about the role that journalism should play, the connection that journalists should have to their communities, the issues that matter to them. Now, I don't expect the debates to be about the weather, but because that was number one. Well, maybe,
Sports, definitely.
Well, extreme weather is part of climate, so maybe it's
Traffic too.
traffic. But what can you learn from this? Is there something we can take from this imperiled, embattled, struggling, but clearly valued thing we call local journalism and that connection in communities, and bring to a national journalist's role, to bring to this most watched event in our political experience, that will infuse a little bit more confidence and trust and connection with the gigantic audience, which also is so hostile towards the national media?
Well, let me start by saying that there are two strong themes from Amy's research that inform what we have tried to do always, and that is to make sure that the news person is neutral. The news person is not putting a thumb on the scale. And the second part is to respect that journalists, we believe, are uniquely experienced and competent to do this, that there is an experience with gathering facts and presenting them in a way that is helpful for the public. That should be a very central piece of running the debate.
Yeah, I would add in there that one of the things we didn't talk about in the earlier discussion, but was in the study, was we asked people to rank what the most important and then the second most important job of the journalist is in their local media among a number of different things, and accuracy far and away ranks as number one. And so there's definitely a desire for being able to understand and see the facts and be able to know that this is what is the factual element of it. We had done a similar, another study that looked at people's ability to distinguish between factual statements and opinions in the news, and a lot of confusion there. So some within the onus, especially in the digital space, of that the public has of being able to filter through and figure out what's actually factual, what's opinion, how do I make sense of all this? That desire for the journalist to play that particular role is very clear and strong.
Paul, what do you think about that?
Look, one statistic I failed to mention, I believe you cited that 64% of local newspapers are meeting the needs of their readers, of what they want to hear and what they want covered. And going back to really how this ties into opinion is, as I look at what type of articles our readers are reading, and that drives them to a subscription, it's at least in our region, it's local news, which is everything from polygamy to alcohol and the beer content to local politics, sports, local sports, religion is fourth, and so we don't get till opinion is number 5. So there's actually, at least among our local readership, again, you pointed out how local newspapers, at least 64%, are meeting the needs of their readers, and it's really heartening to see that data backing that up, that it's not opinion that they're after, but it's actually local journalism.
Would you ever consider scrapping the opinion section?
Yes, if I actually had to, and that's quite frankly one of the things we're looking at scrapping. Endorsement for political candidates.
Interesting.
Is one thing that we're potentially looking at doing. But look, I mean, there is a strong audience, and providing a platform for our readers and the community to express their opinions and to have a debate on our opinion pages is a very important function for a local newspaper.
And I should have asked this earlier, but do you encourage your reporters to engage either in comment sections or on social media with readership in Utah?
Tommy? I think he may have just stepped out. I was going to ask him how much interaction he does. Look, there's been some, we've had both positive experience and negative, because religion is such a strong part of our community. We actually have a religious humorist columnist, which is probably the only one in the country.
Humorist?
Yes, and
need to read that column.
He is widely read, but we've
Sacrilegious?
no. Well, yeah.
It depends on who's writing
yeah.
it. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, we've actually cautioned him, quite frankly, on his social media page to be a little careful, because there's, the conversations can turn quite toxic.
So Frank, that comes back to you in the debates. All right. So I think we'd all agree that social media has, it's got lots of benefits, but it also poisons a lot of wells along the way. And I know some journalists who've been tarnished or flat out lost their jobs because of what they've done on social media, which we never would have. I sent a this is so quaint. I've told this story before because I just think it's a quaint story. When I was bureau chief at CNN, I sent a memo to Correspondents at one point. This is in the dark ages, not that long ago, I think, that said, to Correspondents, when you're doing a live shot, please avoid 2 words, I think. Mm-hmm. The public doesn't care what you think. They care what you see, what you know, what you've heard, what you can observe. Boy, is that out of, there's a reason I'm not there now, I guess. But because here we do encourage our students to think. I thought that was a nice little turn. But how do you deal with this social media hothouse where everybody has a track record now, it seems, and where the public,
Well, I think there's
them?
2 things involved. First of all, I think the big there is no filter on some of the stuff. And I noticed that, I think on the second page of the summary you indicated a significant amount of people enjoy getting their news online. And I was going to ask you, did you mean by that they're going online for their local newspaper news or all their news?
It was online, which was a combination of, for local, but a combination of websites and apps, which was a higher percentage, and then about 15% that said social media specifically.
Okay. And I think the point that was made about the financial difficulty that's out there now in the journalistic community, I don't agree that journalistic problem exists on cable news. I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is particularly the cable news networks going crazy over this whole Russian thing, the investigation, and they're making more money than they've made in a long time. There's an interesting comment by a commentator named Ian Brenner, who's gotten quite popular in talking about politics and economics around the world, who said he thought, just this week it came out, that they lost, at least that portion of the journalistic community, were serving their shareholders by increasing the stock rather than forgetting their real purpose in being to educate the voters on facts, which is an interesting perspective. And I'm not sure there's an answer. I don't have that answer, how to stop that.
Well, let's see if our audience has an answer. We're going to open it up for Q&A now from all of you. We have a microphone dead center in here, so if you have a question or, it's 2019, so a comment, hop on up there.
Well, we will ask you to be sure. We'll spend about 10 minutes with this, 10, 15 minutes, and then we're going to wrap up here. But an interesting time indeed. Carl is making his way. Tell everybody who you are, Carl. Now that
good evening, Carl Stoltz. I teach here at SMPA. I just had a question about sort of the contrasts that I wasn't sure came out in the poll data I saw. First, I'm very mindful of the rural versus urban split in America, and I think that's becoming a greater political split around the country in almost every state now. And naturally, even local news covers where the people are, which is what's happening in the city. And that's where the reporters are usually headquartered. And I wonder if some of the perceptions of the media, both bias and service to the community, is affected by the fact that more and more people that live in rural or far suburban communities aren't really as in tune with what's going on in the city centers. And the city communities maybe are using online more, so aren't necessarily going to buy a newspaper to find out what's going on down the block as much as check social media. And that goes into the other question, which is the generational one. And we got a lot of students here who could maybe help. But I know in my own family, my son does not touch a newspaper unless forced. He gets his news from many other sources, most of which I don't even understand, but where he finds them. But I'm just wondering if there's a generational difference in how people acquire news that came out in the surveys. Thanks.
Amy, why don't we let Amy and Paul go into this one, because you will have studied it and you're living it.
Sure. So to give sort of a quick response, there's definitely differences in the urban, suburban, rural populations, and looking at sort of people describing where they live. In this particular first release, we did not go as deep into that, just because you couldn't do everything in the first release. So there will be some follow-up work that looks more deeply at some of those differences, but definitely, one question around the local coverage, the question of, the sense that you're getting news about sort of yourself and what you're interacting with day in and day out, shows quite substantial differences between those two areas. So there are certainly divides there, and it tends to be the urban, suburban that are more similar, and then the rural that stand apart as being different, the folks that live in those areas. On the question of generational differences, again, this report was not looking at sort of straight demographics, but there's huge generational differences. If you, across our research, what you see is the very much stronger tendency of young people to be digital in general. It was actually sort of 2016, 2017, the growth in digital, though, was actually coming from the older generations. And so that's where we were really seeing the downturn, and this is just news overall and national news, not necessarily local, the downtick in local TV coming from older generations, and the uptick in digital in general, both online and social media. So there's been more movement among that older population, but clearly in the mix of sources and what's being relied on. But it's also the case that young people generally are less, they're less formed in both the extent to which they're really, what is it that they care about day in and day out when it comes to news, kind of how closely they're following news generally, and certainly their political orientations tend to be less formed. And so, for example, when we did the fact opinion study and being able to distinguish there, young people actually did a better job than older people. And some of that, they also didn't show differences according to political nature. So there's an interesting dynamic there, but there's definitely gaps in the ways that people are being informed, and just their orientation to the connection that they have to the news that's going on.
Yes, there's a huge divide between urban and rural. In our community, largest city being Salt Lake City, we have a gay mayor. Certain parts of the rural part of our states, they passed a resolution outright banning anyone from the United Nations from entering their communities. To other communities,
really?
It's still, yes. To other communities.
What would they do with them if they showed up?
I don't know. Fortunately, no one's actually gone through and actually tested that law yet. And then we have other communities, literally several thousand, that are polygamous communities. So we go to where the stories are with our very limited resource, but we would err to focus on more where the population centers are. But we also cover a lot with polygamy and a lot of the crimes that have occurred there and the injustices there, and have been a big part of our brand and our coverage that we develop, even though there's only several thousand people that actually live in those small communities.
Being a newspaper, you must live these generational differences, right? Because do you have college students subscribing to the hard copy newspaper?
No. We live in the youngest state in the union. It's the most digitally advanced state. When I go into my church meetings on Sunday, you have 70, 80-year-old parishioners that are using iPads, and so people read the printed newspaper primarily for comics, for the bridge section, for other advice columns, Sudoku, and so forth. I was looking at taking all that out, and I received the biggest complaint by those items. It's all the news that people read is all digital right now.
Yes.
Sorry.
Hi, I'm Peyton. I'm a student here at SMPA. So as my short time as a student journalist, I've noticed when I'm maybe writing stories that there's a lot of mistrust between the community and me as a journalist trying to go out and speak to people. So how do you think this preconceived bias that members of the community, whether it's locally or nationally, may have against journalists affects their relationship and reporting the stories that ultimately will affect them?
That's a great question. Anita?
Yep.
Olivia, you should answer that.
I don't know the answer to that. The answer is, I think that over the time that I've been reporting, and Olivia would probably agree with me, it's definitely, the skepticism has gotten worse over time. For the last few years, since this last campaign and these last couple of years. But I've always faced it. I feel like we always have faced it, that people don't trust the media. I don't know what the studies show, if it has gotten worse since 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I feel like it's always been there. It's just the thing, it was just like what you were talking about before. Do we take sides? Do we talk about opinion? I just feel like personally, I just don't care about that. I just continue to do what I do. I talk to people. It might be harder now to talk to people. You might have to call 10 more people or talk to more people because some people don't talk to you. The goal is the same. It just makes it harder to do our job, but we still just do our job.
What do you think?
So I worked for the French news agency, Agence France-Presse, covering the White House. I covered all 8 years of the Bush administration, so that includes late 2002, early 2003. And I can tell you a thing or two about asking questions of people who treated you as really persona non grata. Really, just the response from some of the Bush administration folks was, we don't talk to the French. One very senior person said, we're actually going to actively screw AFP and exclude them from a bunch of briefings that we're doing. And it was actually my Associated Press and Reuters colleagues who clued me into that these briefings were happening, and so I just showed up. So I would tend to agree that there's been a lot of hostility built into this forever. And I also, I suspect that people have strong opinions about this, but I also agree with Anita that the point of this is I can only do as good a job as I can to try to inform my listenership now. I've left print media, I'm in radio. I soldier on. I have tried to interact more. I always did this. I learned in the Bush era, especially in that time in the pre-Iraq War, that the single best tool I have to win over a potential reader is to say, well, what questions do you have for me? What do you want to know? What can I tell you? And they would start asking questions about how I did my job and what I thought about certain things. And the more information I provided, and maybe at this point, this might just be rose-colored glasses, but the more information I provided, the more transparency I provided about how I go about my job every single day, the more sort of sympathy I ended up getting from the audience. And in a way, that was a connection to community in a way, because these are people who were so far removed from, here's this half-French guy at the bar in Waco, Texas, because the president's at his ranch. And I would just sit there and be like, come on, all the questions. I'll answer any and all of your questions. And so the combination of just doing your job as best you can, collecting information, using facts and analysis to reduce uncertainty, and coupled with this kind of like, okay, you're a potential reader, talk to me. What do you want to know? And I found that very salutary.
And you stopped ordering crepes when you went out.
Oh man, if you're in Waco, you're not having. Come on, man.
How does that play out? And we've got a lot of questions. We'll get back quickly, so let's do this quickly. But are your reporters at the local level in the community encountering that level of distrust and hostility in the country? You were telling me today that just since the Mueller report Barr memo thing came out, that people are being identified as enemies and reporters, and it's gotten even nastier. Do you have that?
No. We don't have it. We don't have it as much. We've actually gone through a transition over the last 2 to 3 years where a lot of our older, more veteran reporters have transitioned out, and we've brought in a lot of young, outstanding journalists, and we haven't run into that problem at all.
Because it's community, because they know one another, because they're not covering these.
They would run
stories?
a lot of our, I would say, particularly among our female journalists, they run into more, I would say, more misogynistic questions than they would journalistic type questions.
Thank you very much, folks, and thanks for putting on this wonderful event. My name's Alex Parkin. I'm a attorney from Washington, D.C., one of many. I have two questions, actually, for the panel. One in particular for Mr. Huntsman has to do with strategies, new strategies that you guys are using. I think it's a wonderful test case for maintaining readership and continuing to make money in light of the huge technological evolutions that we're living through and continue to live through and will continue to live through. So can you talk a little bit about future plans? And then largely for the panel, or for the panel at large, just a question about, I guess, the impact of the Mueller investigation and the supposed, to use a term, reckoning that the media is now facing in light of perhaps covering that too aggressively, depending on your political leanings. But just some response to that issue. Thanks.
Great. I'll just keep this short and brief. Newspapers are fundamentally community assets. They're just as important as local hospitals, local institutions of higher education. They're absolutely essential for a local community. And as you look at, as one that values and looks at a lot of different business transactions, I've yet to find a sustainable business model for local newspapers. So we really have to look outside the box. We're looking at a number of different options right now to sustain it long term, but it's not going to be a traditional for-profit model.
I was recently down at the Knight Foundation, had a media forum. Actually, that's where we chatted a bit. And the Knight Foundation has committed $300 million over the next 5 years to support local journalism, try different models that will support it. There were a lot of community foundations there that are actually working actively within their communities to support local journalism. So I think the notion of the business model may have to change. That's sort of what you're suggesting. And unless you can be, so you've got the New York Times with 4 million digital-only subscribers as opposed to 2 million. The Boston Globe is 150,000. 200,000, LA Times, 100,000. I mean, you can't do it that way. So yeah, those are the big ones.
Yeah, no, just think about advertising, all the pages you have on a local newspaper to advertising on an iPhone. And it's just, and whatever revenue that is being generated on here is going to Facebook and Google.
Quickly, Mueller reckoning?
I think sort of one of the most disturbing things about journalism today, or how people see journalism, is we're all lumped in together. People, the cable news, people that are talking on cable news, people that are writing stories for different outlets. So in Washington, everything is lumped in together, and it's a problem, right? So in the last 5 days or so, I think that a lot of journalists, including myself, whose primary job was not covering the Mueller investigation. I don't cover Russia. We have someone else that does that. Have been getting a lot of, more mean emails, tweets, whatever, calls.
You're getting that.
Yeah, more than I did. I think that will die down. It's been a few days. I think it'll die down to go back to what it was before, which was still not great, right? It was still pretty negative. But I just think one of the things I wish I could sort of teach everybody out there in the world is, what Olivier said about what we do, how we do it, but also that we're not all the same, right? I'm getting lumped in with everyone else about the Russian investigation. I didn't really write about it, but it's all my fault, right? It's everybody's fault. It's the entire media's fault. And I just wish that we could sort of distinguish between what was done. Now, just in general, will I say, did newspapers in Washington write a lot about it? Yes. Is it a big deal? Yes. And there were still a lot of very important things that were uncovered, particularly at the New York Times and the Washington Post. You can't deny that there were facts of things that had happened. So I don't know. I mean, it's a disturbing thing. I do think it will die down. It's only been a few days.
You want to comment?
I'm going to let the next questioner.
Hi, I'm Giselle. I'm a student here. So we've heard a little bit tonight about neutral moderators and separating fact and opinion. But it seems like a lot of what's going on is actually a much deeper skepticism. It's not just about are these particular facts true, or is this particular person neutral? It's like a broader questioning of can news media ever be neutral? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and how journalists and news agencies can build trust in that kind of environment.
Janet, you want to weigh in on that, even though it's a little out of your
It's the reason that choosing moderators is so hard, is that when we, for instance, ask Chris Wallace to moderate a debate, we're not asking Fox. And we don't ask Fox if it's okay if we ask Chris. And if Chris were to say, I can't do it for whatever reason, that invitation does not get transferred to somebody at Fox. You're asking an individual because you think that person can do a really good job. And I think that the question that was posed before, and Anita's answer, just speaking as a news consumer, not a journalist and not someone who works in this world, it is a really interesting question for journalists, for people who are working there now. One of the things that comes to my mind listening to Anita is the difference between individual reporters and their news organizations, and that some of this very pointed feeling is aimed at news organizations and where they're coming from, and maybe what a reporter's colleagues are doing on the air or in opinion pieces that, as she said, it does get lumped together. And it strikes me that for those of us who all want the same thing, we want to consume news that we believe is accurate and tells us what's going on. And you have hardworking journalists that are trying to produce the same thing. And it's a point at which that the gap between those two, the tension between those two seems really vitriolic and sad and very pointed in terms of the anger that it promotes, and that it's a good time, especially at places like this, for some pretty hard questions to be asked about how does that change going forward, because it affects everything from reading a newspaper article or listening to something or reading it or consuming it online to, do you trust the person that walks out on the stage with the presidential candidates 2 weeks before an election to actually elicit a conversation that you think is sound?
One of the really interesting dynamics you encounter on social media if you're a reporter is someone who will say, I can't believe the mainstream media isn't covering this, link to NBC. Right? and I don't mean to make this an easy lampoon, but you encounter it all the time. The number one comment on one of my stories about Obama naming these wealthy, utterly incompetent, wealthy donors to ambassadorial positions, the number one comment on that story was, this is crap. If Knox were a real reporter, he'd be writing about big donors getting ambassadorships. Literally the topic of the story. So the trust thing is really complicated, because what I encounter time and time again is people who, I hate the Washington Post. Oh, look, this story confirms my worldview, tweet. And so I don't know how to wrap my brain around this, except to say that these statements of mistrust can't be trusted, because when it's reaffirming, and this is a whole other conversation about Americans siloing themselves in ideological slots. I don't necessarily trust it, which is why I actually do take the open view and ask them to ask me questions. What is it about this you think is unfair? What is it about this that you think is not objective?
Amy, what are the trust numbers now?
Well, so, if you ask general trust in national media, general trust in local media, you have, about a quarter that put a lot of trust in local, 20% national. But the big difference is that political divide. And after 2016, we saw, much greater numbers rising among Democrats, declining in all these different areas among Republicans. But the other thing that's interesting is the individual sources you see. So this goes back to 2014. So we did a study that asked about 30 plus specific news outlets. Do you go there? Do you trust them? Do you distrust them? And those that would be in that consistent conservative bucket used and trusted, were the exact mix that folks that were the consistent liberals distrusted. And so there's this, not only this doesn't fit in my trust bucket, it's in my distrust bucket. And I'm going to choose to reject what is said. But at the same time, in the fact and opinion statements, both sides of the aisle were more likely to to call something a factual statement if it agreed with the view that their party espoused across the line. So, there's definitely a complex situation that's at play here, and it has been going on for several years.
Frank, isn't it bigger than that, though? I think that what's happened in the last 20 years is I'm a Catholic. What's happened in the Catholic Church has hurt trust. What's happened with corporations, what happened when the economy went down. I mean, you can go through basic fundamental institutions in our society, including the media, and the American people have lost trust in those institutions. I don't know whether Pew did it, but I've seen some polls that show that. So it may be, this is part of, and I think the last 2 years intensified it, but part of a concern the American people have as to where they can turn for trust, whether they're talking about religion, whether they're talking about anything in their society.
I think that's a really important observation. It suggests that news organizations, like other institutions and corporations, whatever, have to really think very deeply and very strategically about this, because it's not just about what we do today, tomorrow, or whatever. We promised to get you out of here about now, so why don't we do 1 or 2 more questions and then let people go have dinner and get on with their lives. And if you don't get a question in, come on up and talk to people when we're done. Why don't we put the 2 of you together, and then we'll let everybody answer, okay? Go for it.
You go first. Okay. Hi, my name is Michael Schnell, and I'm a student here at GW. I'm a journalism and political science major. So my question had to do with the discussion about the presidential debate moderators. A lot of what was spoken about tonight was that there's distrust by some people in the moderator and their political ideologies and their leans, as well as the news organizations they come from, even though they don't necessarily represent those organizations. Has it ever been considered to put multiple moderators on the stage from different organizations, from different political leanings, and let them all collaborate for the debate? I moderated last week the Student Association debate here, and the format that we took was we had a panel in front of all the candidates, and 4 people, 1 person from each news organization was represented, and I then gave them each the opportunity to ask a question on behalf of their organization. Has a format in that way, rather than trying to keep it unbiased when a lot of people come with their bias?
Let me tell you what our experience was on that, because it was the reason, and Janet mentioned, in 1992 at Michigan State, we did an experiment. Prior to that time, as Janet indicated, we had a moderator and a panel of reporters. Well, I can tell you, reporter number 1 thought really long and hard on a question to ask, to show how brilliant they were, but also to get to the facts. And so they would ask that question. And under the rules, there was so many minutes for each candidate to respond. And then it was to go to reporter number 2. Well, if they didn't answer the question of reporter number 1, reporter number 2 is not going to give away their question and go back to follow. So what we did is we did 1 half of the debate was with the moderator and the panel, and the other half was with a single moderator. It was Jim Lair, as I recall. And we determined that no, a panel is not the way to go. With 1 moderator who knows their stuff and has the ability to drill down and follow up so that the candidates are not just giving the normal 2-sentence statement they normally give on the trail and so forth. So we tried that. It just hasn't worked.
And the reason is, just to follow up on that, the whole point of this is to hear from the candidates. And people find it astonishing that in the first debate in 2012, where we went to these 6 15-minute pods, in the first 30 minutes of the debates, the moderator used less than 2
minutes.
2 minutes, less than 2 minutes. So when you take into account the fact the public really wants to hear from the candidates, the more, it's not an idea that has not been tried, and it certainly works in other places, and I hear your objective clearly. But the more people you put on the stage, the more time you take away from the candidates.
What do you guys think of the primary debates where they've got crowds there and there's applause and there's...
Frank loves them.
Yeah, right. As you know...
Did you see those? The primary debates where the audience is applauding?
Just before our debate starts, Janet and I and the co-chairman go out and we talk to the audience and talk to them about how fortunate that they are. They're in this audience. They're an eyewitness to a part of history. Please do not clap. Do not make sounds, and so forth. That there's 100 million people watching at home or wherever they're watching, and it's unfair for you to interfere with what they're trying to perceive and make an educated judgment on. And we never really had much problem with that until the 2016 primary debates, where the networks, I mean, I know in some they probably were holding up a sign saying applause, you know, like they used to do on some of the quiz shows. And it just created a problem for us, more than, it wasn't out of hand. I mean, it was in two locations that I can think of where there were people who started to clap, and whether Chris or Anderson had to turn around and say, please, but it's a problem. We hate that. So I always mention to them the Secret Service is here, and if you'd like to meet them, continue to make some noise, and that usually quiets them down.
Our last question.
Hi, I'm Katie Watson. I help cover the White House for CBS. Something that I think has bubbled up in this conversation and that I have been grappling with myself is how our readers, viewers really don't understand how journalism works. For instance, a recent Columbia Journalism Review study found that 60% of respondents found or believed that sources pay journalists, which, you know, I didn't know that. I'd be wealthy at this point. But how much of a responsibility lies on reporters, on journalism, to educate our readers, our viewers about how our profession works, but then also from the education perspective, how much of this is the fault of our education system?
That's Frank's job.
It is, and I'll take a piece of that. Paul, you want to weigh in as a guy who actually pays reporters to do their job?
Yeah, the only comment I'll say on that is since I've acquired the paper, and again, this is something that's easier to do on the local level, and that is to have much more engagement with your readers. So whether you have informal or formal events, we have a lot of engagement time with our readers, which again, you know, as you begin to put a face by the byline, a lot of the prejudice and a lot of the concern, and as you're educated on the process, a lot of those barriers and prejudices are broken down. But on a national level, I think it would be much more challenging.
I'll share a thought on that, and then maybe you'd like to do that, and Amy, you make a closing thought here, and we can let everybody get on, or anybody else who's got a closing thought on this as well, because I think it's a very big and a very serious problem. I think that there is an arrogance, especially in the national media, that is perceived and sometimes real. I remember last fall I went out to Kansas and I talked to the Kansas Medical Society about the book that I had written, which is about asking questions. And they got on to the national media and made a reference that has been made to them that they've heard about Kansas being flyover country. And they were just gigantically insulted by that. Here is a room full of brilliant doctors, and this is what they hear a reference to. There is no network bureau anywhere near Kansas. There's no reporter who comes through Kansas who's talked to them, but they see themselves talked about. So we've got to start talking about, stop or do less talking about people and more talking with people visibly. I think NPR, by the way, does an excellent job of that. NPR, and you hear it in their stories, they are out in the country. We were talking yesterday about German TV. German TV does a better job getting out across America than a lot of American television, right? You did a bus tour across America covering this for German television, right? 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles, okay? Try getting that on a cable channel today, on an American cable channel. You won't. So that's one thing. Secondly, we insist, generically, on accountability from everybody. We want everybody to be open and transparent. But we're not very open and transparent about the process, about how stories get selected, how reporters get selected, how the lead gets selected, and then when we get criticized, we shut down. Every news organization should have a public editor or an ombudsman to take those criticisms and answer back to the public. And engage that conversation if you're going to have a conversation. We talk about reporter engagement. How do you engage with your viewers? How do your reporters? You don't, or you do over social media. But what is that? What shape does that take? We need to think about that. If an airline, and there are some now, faced the confidence issues that journalism faced, they'd hire every consultant in the planet. They'd take gigantic retreats, and they'd do some very serious thinking about how they reposition themselves and explain themselves. And I think that's some of what needs to happen in journalism. There needs to be a little bit more humility, especially at the national level. I think that, as you point out, your local journalists are in touch by definition, or more in touch by definition. But I defer to other colleagues. What do you think?
I think we do a terrible job of telling our own stories, explaining what we do and how we do it. I'll give you an example. I mean, this pains me. So I lead the White House Correspondents Association, and even among DC reporters, I can maybe rely on about 5% of them to know what that means.
What means?
To lead the White House Correspondents Association. People really, honestly, only know the dinner because it's this one flashy televised thing. They have no idea. This is sometimes reporters on the White House beat. No idea what I do. And I've tried to sort of talk more about it and tell our own story and be like, this is what we do. I just spent 4 hours in a meeting talking about where the sunroof on a press van should go. It's that level of glamour. But we do a terrible job. And this is what I was trying to get at by saying, ask me questions. It's very different for me than it is for you, because I have seen women reporters' mentions on Twitter. And so inviting you to engage with readers is a very different thing than inviting a peer of yours who's a guy. I'm very mindful of that. And by the way, if you're a dude, ask your colleague, your women colleagues, to show you what their Twitter mentions look like. It will alter your life. But I do think that inviting people to ask questions, if that, to the degree that's doable, is good. And I do think there needs to be more transparency, whether it's through an ombuds person or a public editor, or just, I think the Times has started to do this, just sort of like how we picked the story, how we reported the story, how we didn't report the story. You know, there are a lot of those things. I mean, there's not going to be like a Martin Luther Reformation in the news media. There are going to be 100 of them. And they're all going to be different outlets, and they're all going to be different people coming up with different solutions and engaging their readership in a different way, and all trying to arrive at that same goal of demystifying the process and giving readers a sense of a stake in this thing. And I will not be one of them. I mean, I've tried to bring in the regional and local reporters, the people from Kansas, to tell some of those stories, because I think they're really, really important. But I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all solution.
We've gone long and over, and I apologize, but it's been a fascinating conversation. But final thoughts, anybody else, before we go in a word?
I think that all really sums it up, but it's getting out of the institution, the label of the institution, to being a person and that connection. And it sort of all comes back to then that's what can garner the trust. That's how people can think about how do I make sense of this information I'm seeing here? How do I process it? You know, if ultimately this reporting is being done for the public to help inform them to make decisions so our democracy can function, having that in the front of mind of how do I create that relationship so that the public understands what I'm doing and can make sense of all this stuff that's coming at them, because the way news works today is so different than in the past in terms of how the public has to process it.
And the public itself is going to have to step up and have a bigger role. I mean, you're now responsible for your consumption. It's like food. Okay, we can label everything, but you've got to decide whether you're going to eat a healthy diet or not. And most people don't, labels notwithstanding. So there we go. I want to thank Olivier and the White House Correspondents Association for doing this with us and helping to bring people together here and knitting this idea of what we can learn from the local journalistic experience, and perhaps, passing that to our colleagues elsewhere. And I want to thank Frank and Janet for coming over and sharing your insight and how you wrestle with debates. And if there are any people in the audience who'd like to moderate the next debate, I think they're open for applications. Things are getting pretty weird. Nita, thank you for taking time out of your political constant deadlines. And Amy, for your research and for all your help. And I really hope you find the business model.
Stay tuned.
I hope that will be an inspiration for others. So thanks to you all very, very much. Thanks for coming out, and wish them all good luck.